Good afternoon and welcome to Stewardship's May Treasurer Dial-In. Welcome back to those who've joined us before and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. My name's Alex and I work within the Marketing and Communications team here at Stewardship, and I'll be your host on today's Dial-In. Today I'm also going to be joined by Hough, Stephen Mathews and Rachel Steeden. Alan and Stephen are our senior consultants here at Stewardship and Rachel is our legal advisor. If this is your very first dial-in with us, or perhaps you're just not fully au fait with all that Stewardship do, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about us. Stewardship's vision is for the world to encounter Jesus through the generosity of his church. And we seek to achieve that in three key ways: inspire greater generosity, strengthen Christian causes, and make giving easy. Today's dial-in is all about strengthening each of you in the important role that you do within your churches and charities, and by extension, bolstering the Christian causes you represent. If you'd like to find out more about how we can support your church or charity, take a look at the website or email or call John Keskes, our Head of Partnerships, and his details should be on your screen right now. You might have noticed that this time around, we've made the dial-in simpler for you to join, and we're really glad that so many of you have joined us today. Please do note, though, that if you'd like to receive the follow-up email from today's call, including the podcast recording and the briefing papers mentioned, you'll need to sign up for the Treasurer Dial-In mailing list. And you'll be able to find the sign-up form at stewardship.org.uk/dial-in. Just scroll down to the bottom of the page and it should be appearing right now in your chat window. So, moving swiftly on to today's agenda, we've changed the format slightly so there'll be no meatier topic this time, and instead we're including a few extra mosquito effects, those small annoying things that can come back to bite, so that we can cover a wider range of topics and updates. In this Dial-In's mosquito effects, we're going to look at the latest Charity Commission update, tax and the spring statement, why your donors might benefit from gift aid carryback, 3 messages on gift aid, a SORP update, how to build gospel partnership with your donors, what's new in payroll, and staff salaries, Stewardship's thoughts. We're then going to have our Q&A section to finish off the call. We do encourage participation, so if you have any questions on the call today, please do use the chat function within Zoom to ask them, and we'll answer as many as we can during the call. In case you aren't sure how to do this, if you've joined us via webinar today, you'll see a chat icon on your screen. Click in there to type in your questions and make sure to send these to all panelists, as this ensures that we'll see your questions and be able to answer them. Those who are dialed in purely on your phone, I'm afraid that you won't be able to ask a question on the call, but hopefully the resources we send out afterwards will be sufficient in answering any questions that you might have. You can also feel free to email us via the details provided if you've got any questions that you weren't able to ask on the call today. Okay, so let's kick off with the first item on the agenda. We're going to be looking at the recent Charity Commission updates. Over to you, Alan.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Alex. So from time to time, the Charity Commission provide updates and guidance, and these are designed to help charity trustees better carry out your functions, your duties and your responsibilities. Whilst they don't always impact churches, we would suggest that you keep a general eye out for what's new, and also just to see how the Commission's thinking is developing. Here are just a couple that have caught our eye since the time we had the last dial-in. Firstly, safeguarding and protecting people. The Commission emphasises that safeguarding is a key governance priority for trustees of all charities, and not just those who are working with groups traditionally considered to be at risk. They draw attention to recently updated guidance, which states that as part of fulfilling your trustee duties, trustees must take reasonable steps to protect from harm all people who come into contact with your charity. This includes staff and volunteers, as well as others that benefit from your charity's work. The guidance speaks about having safeguarding policies that are properly applied, making use of DBS checks, and particularly how to treat workers from overseas who may not be part of any UK system, protecting staff and volunteers, safeguarding children or adults at risk, issues when working overseas, how to handle and report incidents and allegations, and there is separate updated guidance has been provided for workers and volunteers as to how to report a serious incident and also how to report serious wrongdoing, and working with or making grants to other organisations. Have they themselves got suitable safeguarding policies in place? We will send a link out to the Commission's guidance follow up to this bill. The second area that I want to mention is unlikely to have such a wide application, but is nonetheless important. And this is guidance for charities with a connection to a non-charity. In this guidance, the Commission recognises that there are many good reasons for charities in establishing and maintaining close connections with non-charitable organisations. However, they go on to emphasise that the purpose of this connection must be to help the charity make a positive difference to its beneficiaries. The Commission go on to suggest some reasons why a charity may wish to have such a connection. Not all of the reasons that they suggest are likely to apply to churches, but there are three that are worth mentioning. Firstly, as a way of managing risk. A good example could be a church running a cafe as part of its community activities. Rather than keep the cafe as part of the church, it may choose to establish it as a non-charity organisation, so that if the cafe runs into financial trouble, its finances will be ring-fenced and will not bring the whole church down with it. Secondly, is an effective trading structure to raise funds for the charity. Now, this is a well-trodden path for many charities who use a profit-making trading structure, often a subsidiary company, as a means of funding the charity. It's probably more likely to be Christian charities that use this model, but it's not unheard of in a church context. And thirdly, to provide an opportunity to strengthen the quality, reach, and impact of your charity's work. This could, for example, be a CIC, that's a community interest company, which a church forms to run a particular part of its ministry. Often this might be a project or initiative which impacts on its local community. Other examples of connections provided by the Commission, but perhaps less likely to impact churches, are as a main source of funding or to provide other valuable resources to the charity. Now, whilst recognising these potential benefits, the guidance does go on to suggest that such connections may also bring significant risks. And as such, trustees, firstly, must not allow your charity's resources or activities to support non-charitable purposes. An example here might be where a private nursery is run out of the church premises. In order to support such a venture, the trustees must be clear how the venture meets its charitable purpose. And this might not always be quite as straightforward as it would first appear. And secondly, trustees should identify, properly address, and then review any risks which come from the connection with a non-charity organisation. So if your church or charity has such a connection to a non-charity organisation, then please do read the guidance in full. And again, we'll provide a link to this as a follow-up to the dial-in.
Thanks so much, Alan. That was really helpful. Okay, so now we're going to go over to Steeden for a review of the tax and spring statement.
Thank you, Alex. Now, in March, the Chancellor made his normal spring statement on tax. In reality, it held little or nothing for charities, unsurprisingly given the circumstances, other than some minor changes to the retail gift aid scheme, which I'm not going to cover, as I've not seen any churches using it. But there are some other bits of tax news that I think it's important for some of you who are listening. First is around provided accommodation, manses, vicarages and the like. Now, the change that has been announced is for some higher education workers, but it shows a direction of travel for HMRC and some of their thinking. We understand that HMRC have written to higher and further education employers, limiting and removing some exemptions that were previously available in that sector on provided accommodation. This was on the grounds of it not being customary that such accommodation was provided. Now, we can't presume the manse and vicarage exemptions will continue forever as they are now, although our understanding is that this is not being actively considered for change at this point by HMRC. The second area is about making tax digital. This is a reminder, and this currently only affects VAT. If you're a VAT registered and a charitable company, this is now in force for you. I believe CIOs will be included as well because they're corporate in the tax world. If you're a trust, then this does not apply until October, but it's only 5 months away. So if you are VAT registered, not making tax digital in your own case, you've got to do something about it. Third is a reminder on off-payroll working. The private sector is shortly to be impacted by the government regulations over off-payroll working, or as it's known commonly, IR35. This is where you hire someone who works through a limited company, but the relationship is more like that of a staff member. Changes are coming from April 2020, so this time next year, making organisations responsible for paying tax as if the contract was under PAY or national insurance and they're on your payroll. The April 2020 changes are initially for large clients, not small organisations. So you have to have 50 individuals or more to be impacted by this time next year. That's 50 individuals on payroll. There is a tax consultation of this in the moment, but why we're saying this is that we want you to be aware that if you contract with someone via a limited company, this by itself does not prevent you having to think about the relationship from a tax perspective, as it will come at some point to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, moving on to a topic related to charitable giving now, and we're delighted to introduce you to Rachel Steeden, our in-house legal advisor with a special remit for philanthropy. And Rachel's going to explain why your donors might benefit from gift aid carryback.
Thanks, Alex. So the new tax year began on the 6th of April, of course, but it's not too late for your members to make a tax-efficient gift for the tax year 2018-2019. As you'll know, your members can only claim gift aid on a donation if they've paid enough income or capital gains tax in that year to cover the basic rate tax that the church reclaims, as well as any higher or additional rate tax that they reclaim personally. So if a member's income has gone down since last year, perhaps they've retired or taken maternity leave, they might not pay enough tax to give under gift aid this year. Instead, your member could ask HMRC to carry back their donations and treat this year's giving as if it had been done last year. Assuming your member paid enough tax last year to cover the gift aid on last year and this year's donations, carryback will boost the value of the member's donations to your church this year by 25p for every pound. So this is well worth considering. Carryback is also really useful for givers who have a variable income, perhaps because they're self-employed. They can wait until they've prepared their accounts for the 2018-19 year, work out how much they can afford to give under gift aid for that year, and then make the donation now, asking HMRC to carry it back to last tax year. So how can your giver carry back gift aid? If they complete a tax return, there's a simple box on there which asks how much of the current year's giving should be treated as carried back to the previous year. There's just one catch here though, which is quite important. A giver who needs to complete a tax return can only carry back a donation if they do so before they file their return. Once they've filed their return, it's too late to carry back, even if they filed long in advance of the deadline. Givers who don't file a tax return can ask HMRC for a form P810, which they'll need to submit by the 31st of January 2020. So there's plenty of time to sort this out. If you'd like any more information about gift aid carryback, you can find some details on the HMRC website. We'll be sending a link, and there's also a stewardship briefing paper to fill you in. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And yeah, don't forget, as Rachel said, you can find briefing papers about gift aid carryback in the email that we'll send you after the call today, provided that you sign up for it at stewardship.org.uk/dial-in. And you can find all of our briefing papers at stewardship.org.uk/briefing papers. Our next mosquito effect is brought to us by Stephen, who has 3 further gift aid messages for us. Stephen?
Thank you. Now, I just want to get across 3 quick messages on gift aid. The first is about the Gift Aid Small Donation Scheme, or GASDS. The level for individual gifts in cash or contactless payment has risen from £20 per gift to £30 per gift. So, a £50 note is still not okay, but £30 in an envelope is now fine. The upper limit on all eligible gifts is unchanged at £8,000 per year per eligible community building. And remember, you don't need to know who the gift is from when you claim under GASDS. Remember also that claiming GASD has a short timetable for claiming. It's only 2 years to each 5th of April. So now we're into the 2019-20 tax year. You can only claim for gifts in the tax years 2017-18 and 2018-19. So do make sure you keep up to date with your claims. For those not using GASD or unfamiliar with it, we do have a briefing paper on our website, and it's going to a new one updating for these changes is going in the next couple of days. Second message is that HMRC wants you to use full first names and not just initials on the claim spreadsheet. This is despite showing initials in their example. But HMRC have dropped their policy of trying to make this law. There was definite pushback from the charity community, including ourselves. So this is not the law. You don't have to have full names. You can still just use initials. The third, and this is possibly the saddest mosquito I've ever had to talk about in the dial-in. From my perspective, it is a disaster for the church nationally with HMRC and with the wider public. HMRC recently published a list of their top 10 tax prosecutions in 2018. One was a church pastor. £150,000 of fraudulent gift aid claims. This was a relatively small church in Luton. The pastor was the approved individual with HMRC for claiming gift aid and was the only authorised user of the church bank account. He added names of individuals who didn't give the church and added extra amounts to those that did when making the claim. He paid those extras to himself out of the church bank account. HMRC newsfeed on this simply says, a church leader from Luton who lied about charity donations and was jailed for 4 years. What's the moral? Why am I saying this? To drill home again that finance is a team sport. We keep saying it because it's vital. It really is important to widen finance responsibilities and not just accept the status quo. A minimum of 2 sets of eyes should be on all aspects of finance. Because this sort of thing that we've just talked about happens in all sorts of churches, including ones like yours and mine. And just as a final lifting after that very sad point is, remember, the change limits for donor benefits, the amount you can give back to someone who's donated under gift aid that we talked about in the last dial-in, that has now started from effect from the 6th of April. And there's a link in the mail we're sending out at the end of the call. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Some really important lessons for us all there. If any of this is something that concerns or directly affects you, we've got a helpful briefing paper entitled Financial Controls, which you can find at stewardship.org.uk/briefing papers. And it will be included in the follow-up email at the end of the call, along with a blog post called Finance is a Team Sport. Don't forget that you can ask your questions at any time during the call, thanks to those that have already started doing that. Simply click on the chat icon on the screen and select all panelists and type in your question. Our next mosquito effect is the SORP update, brought to you by Alan. Over to you, Alan.
Great, thanks, Alex. Now, for those of us who've got used to preparing accruals accounts under the charity SORP, that is charities that are either structured as companies or with income above £250,000, we're beginning to understand the need to show comparative figures. So those comparative figures feature in the financial review section of the trustees' annual report. By fund type, either on the face of the statement of financial activities or by way of note to the accounts, on the balance sheet, and also, of course, within the various notes to the accounts. In fact, everywhere that the SORP requires a figure to be included in the accounts, then a comparative figure for the prior year or period must also be shown. This means that comparative figures must be shown in all the notes in the accounts, and that includes those that cover the movements in individual restricted and designated funds, and also the assets and liabilities that represent those funds at the end of the year. Now, for churches which have quite a number of restricted or designated funds, this means an awful lot of numbers appearing in the notes to the accounts. So being clear in your presentation so as to avoid confusion is important. Generally, the approach that we see most often shows the prior year comparatives after the current year figures. The examples which are on the slides and which will be made available as a follow-up to the dial-in are taken from our own pro forma accrual accounts template, which sets out the details for the current year first and then follows that up with using the same format for the previous year. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alan. We're going to go back to Rachel now, who's going to share how you can build gospel partnerships with your donors.
Thanks, Alex. So I work with our philanthropy services team in looking after our major donors, some of whom are giving tens or hundreds of thousands or even millions. I've been asked to share something from my experience with our clients about how you can make your church good for major donors to give to. I realise, of course, this won't be relevant for all of our listeners, so please bear with me. The starting point is, of course, the same as for any giver: accountability. If a major donor is going to trust your church with a significant gift, then they'll want to be sure that their gift will be well managed for maximum impact. Financial information about the church's budget and accounts needs to be communicated effectively and regularly to donors and, of course, also the wider church family. We've said lots about this in previous dial-ins, and you'll find resources on our website to help you think through this aspect further. But I've been surprised over recent months by the number of wealthy Christians I've encountered who feel truly burdened by the responsibility of stewarding great wealth. They're rightly concerned to make sure they're giving for heavenly reward, not earthly recognition, and they're perhaps acutely aware of a disparity of wealth between them and many of their church family. But this can leave wealthy Christians feeling isolated and unable to discuss an important area of their discipleship with their Christian friends. We see in Romans 12 that giving generously is a spiritual gift that God gives to some Christians, and which they can use to build up the body of Christ for his glory. In our churches, we pray for and develop all kinds of other gifts like preaching or praying or music or serving. So I wonder how we might do the same for the gift of giving in an appropriate way. Something that we're now trying in my own church is encouraging givers to get together, to pray for and encourage each other in their giving. Also to have honest conversations about some of those tricky issues like deciding how much to give, what to give to, how and when to involve your children. Stewardship also supports a conference called Generous Journey, which provides an opportunity for these peer-to-peer conversations with very wealthy Christians from across different churches. Whilst of course it would not be right for your church's leadership to know the details of individuals' giving, I wonder whether your church leaders pray regularly for your givers. You could pray they'd resist the temptation to spend their money on matching the lifestyle of their peers rather than continuing to be generous. And perhaps most importantly of all, you can pray in line with the parable of the sower that their faith in Christ wouldn't be choked by the deceitfulness of riches and desires for other things. If you'd like to think some more about these issues, there are lots of helpful articles and videos on the websites of Generosity Path and Gospel Patrons, and we've put those addresses up for you on the slide.
Thanks so much, Rachel. That was really helpful. Next up, we've got Alan again, who's going to share what's new in payroll.
Great, thanks, Alex. As most of us know, running our own payroll is not straightforward. Most years there are operational changes that need to be incorporated, and our general advice is that unless you are very competent in this area, it's one area to outsource to others. We ourselves here operate a payroll bureau service for churches, as will many accountancy and bookkeeping firms. Now, there were several changes to payroll that came into effect in April 2019. And so if you are responsible for running your own payroll, now is a good time to check that you are complying with the latest legislation. Many thanks to our payroll team who've provided this 5-point update. Point 1 is around national minimum wage and national living wage. From the 6th of April 2019, you should now be paying everyone over the age of 25 at the rate of at least £8.21 per hour. For your younger employees, the rates for national minimum wage have also changed, so please do check that you're paying at the correct levels. And remember, where you do have younger employees, keep an eye on birthdays occurring during the year and make sure that you pay at the correct level for the correct age. Secondly, pension auto-enrolment minimum contribution levels. The minimum contribution levels for pension auto-enrolment also increased in April. The total paid into a pension for your eligible employees should now be 8% of qualifying earnings, with a minimum of 3% being paid by you, the employer. For many employees, this change will result in a reduction in take-home pay, as their own contribution may well have increased from 3% to 5%. Many employers are now approaching their pension re-enrolment window. The pensions regulator will definitely send reminders on this, but do remember to enrol any eligible employees who have opted out more than a year ago, and do file your redeclaration of compliance by the due date, as there are penalties for late filing. Thirdly, payslip requirements. The legal requirements for payslip reporting have also changed this tax year. When you pay variable amounts to workers or employees, perhaps to cover evening or unsocial hours work, it is no longer acceptable to show a simple total. The payslip must now show a breakdown including the hourly rate and the number of hours worked at each rate. This greater detail is designed to help employees understand their pay and ensure that they are being paid correctly. The requirements will also ensure that it becomes clearer if an employer is not paying the individual at the correct rate of national minimum wage, national living wage, or indeed holiday pay. Fourthly, postgraduate student loans. It is now possible for an employee to have deductions for more than one student loan. The new starter checklist has been updated to include details on the new postgraduate student loan, so make sure that you're using the latest version with your new employees. That is now available on the gov.uk website. Also, make sure that your own payroll software has been updated to accommodate the changes to student loan calculations. And if deductions for more than one loan have been calculated, then they should be shown separately on the payslip. And finally, the Employment National Insurance Allowance. So the Employment National Insurance Allowance continues at the same rate in the 2019-2020 tax year. So eligible employees do not have to pay the first £3,000 of their employer national insurance liability. However, for larger employees, and that's those with a national insurance bill of £100,000 a year or more, 2019-20 will be the last year that you will be able to claim this allowance. For smaller employers, the good news is that the allowance appears likely to continue for the foreseeable future.
Thanks so much, Alan. That leads nicely onto our final mosquito effect, actually, which is in response to a question we're often asked here at Stewardship: how do we handle staff salaries? Steeden will start by sharing Stewardship's thoughts, and Alan will then share what this looks like in practice in his own church. Steeden?
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, staff are said to be the church's most important asset. They're also often one of the greatest costs. So today, as we start into a new fiscal year, we want to talk a bit about pay. Now, I want to ask you a few questions. First question I've got is process. What is your process? The Charity Commission asks in their annual return questions whether the charity has a written policy on paying staff. It means more than, yes, we pay them. It's about how you review what you pay staff. It's interesting, when Global Connections did their last salary survey, which we at Stewardship sponsored, that 5% of churches reviewed pay less often than annually, some not at all. That same survey found that 85% of churches thought that what they paid was what was necessary or more than necessary. That suggests 15% paid a lot less than necessary. But when asked whether it was more or less than the position merited, over a third said it was less than the position merited, which was more like the staff survey response, where 35% considered their salary was less than adequate. So you're seeing around about a third where there seems to be a significant problem. And a further good number weren't able to properly pay into pensions, and more were in debt personally as a result. So the first question we've got is, do you have this process? We're concerned that churches aren't thoughtful enough in how they review pay levels and let staff fall behind inflation. Are you? The second question is about pay levels themselves. What do you think is the right level? This is actually a really difficult issue. Other than in mainstream denominations, there are no simple comparable pay scales into which you just slot your own pastor or minister. There is the Global Connection survey referred to, but it was in 2012, and there are no plans from our discussions with them to redo it. And it does slightly beg as many questions as it answers. How to value housing, the number of hours worked, whether spouses of pastors also receive income, etc., etc. And it is also distorted by what are called semi-voluntary pay levels, e.g. full-time salaries of pastors are up under £15,000. That can't be commercial or sensible. Now, so what is a good benchmark? Well, the most common benchmark we see is that of teachers' pay. It's very public, it's out there, you can see lots and lots of grades. It is somewhat difficult to compare responsibilities between church ministers and teachers too exactly. But this is the one we use in our own church with some tweaks as the sort of general basis of are we in the right order. So, at Stewardship, we are concerned, given the importance of this area of pastoral and other staff pay, that churches don't invest enough in thinking about absolute levels of pay or communicating this to staff. So the question is, what do you do? The third question is about, have you thought about the relationship between pastors' pay and others? Now, in this area, there are two sets of others. The one is church members, and two is other staff, although this is maybe only a question for you in the larger churches. Comparing with church members, do you have a view as to how different the church leader's pay is from that of the average member? Now, there's no right or wrong in this, but my sense is that it can be unhelpful if it is much higher or much lower than the average church member, because it can breed resentment one way or the other. The Global Connection survey found that about 10% of churches paid their leaders above the average income of the church members, but nearly half paid distinctly less than the average member. My next question is, what do you think is the case in your situation? And do you think that's right? Moving to the second group, comparison with other staff. How much more is the pay of the senior leader from their number two? Again, I don't believe there is a right or wrong answer, but it is interesting that what we see in this area appears decided more by culture than by intentional biblical-based thought. So my next question is, what do you think is the case in your situation? Again, do you think that's right? And the final point, general, is don't forget about retirement. Pension does need thinking about. It's made easier now that there is a minimum 8%, of which at least 3%, so up to 3% has to be paid by the employer, unless it's paid by the, start that one again. 8%, of which at least 3% needs to be paid by the employer, and up to 5% needs to be paid by the employee if the employer doesn't pay. But you've got to think about pensions, particularly where you are providing housing and they have no housing in the long run. In my own church, we pay 5% as the employer into a pension scheme, but we also match extra additional contributions of the staff, so that if they pay more than their minimum requirement of 3%, we will double that up. So don't forget about retirement, because particularly when there is no housing that they have themselves in the long run because you're providing it, it's a very important long-term aspect in their finances. Over to you, Alan.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Yes, as Stephen said at the outset, there is no single right way to try and address this issue, and it's not very easy to get this right within a church context. I'm sure, like many of you, we've also struggled to find a process that works well and addresses the types of issues that Stephen has raised. But what I just want to do now is outline a process that we've actually introduced at our church recently, and which we hope will provide some sort of consistent process for setting pay levels. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to run through the exact figures, but I will run through some of the general principles. So our starting point is that we are a Baptist church, and as such, we have access to what the Baptist Union calls the standard stipend. And so we use this as our starting point for all of our ministry staff. Also available from the BU is something referred to as a manse value. Now, whilst the BU make it clear that this is a figure provided to help churches calculate pensionable salary, we do use it as our starting point to enhance the salary levels of ministry staff for whom we do not provide a manse. Step 2. We then recognise that that standard stipend provided by the BU is a national figure, and as such takes no account of geography. So we apply an agreed uplift to both the stipend figure and the manse value figure to reflect the fact that we live in the southeast of England. For us, this is a fixed percentage and applies to all our ministry staff roles, whether full or part-time. Step 3. We then apply an upwards adjustment to the stipend to reflect additional responsibilities that a pastor may undertake. This could be leading a team, or it could be some other responsibility. This percentage for us is discretionary, depending upon the additional responsibility, but is capped. It's not an open-ended increase. Step 4, we then apply an upward adjustment to the stipend to reflect skills, training, or experience. Again, this is discretionary, but a capped percentage. and is determined as part of our annual staff appraisal process, so will change from year to year. Step 5, we keep under review the level of employers' contributions that we make to staff pensions, as Steeden previously mentioned. At our church, we pay a flat rate of 10% of all staff salaries. But also be aware, as we said earlier, that there are increases associated with those in auto-enrolment pensions, so don't forget that. Step 6, we then keep under review the value of our staff expenses policy and what is paid in addition to stipend and housing allowance. So this includes things like the provision of mobile phones, mileage and subsistence allowance, and other allowances that we treat as gross pay and therefore pay through the payroll. And step 7, finally, we apply then a reasonableness benchmark check, comparing the final figures to other local pay scales. We don't tend to seek to benchmark against members' salaries, as we feel that being a commuter town, this may be distorted by higher London salaries, which are often paid to help compensate the cost of travel commuting. Before we introduced this system, there was a tendency for salary levels to be determined on a more bespoke basis. Now, whilst this bespoke basis could be objective, there were also times when it was really just random. We like Joe, so let's pay him a bit more. And it was actually very difficult to justify if we were challenged. Now, I'm not advocating this as being the right way for your church, and indeed we'll see over time whether it's even the right approach for our own church. But one thing that it does, however, do is that it allows me to answer positively that Charity Commission question about whether we have a written policy on paying staff. So all is not lost.
Thanks, both of you. If you're interested in this topic, you'll want to sign up for Stewardship's Sharpen email, as we're going to be creating a more in-depth blog on the subject in June. And somebody's just written a question to say, will the slides be available after the call? And they will. Again, you can sign up to receive all of the follow-up resources and bits and pieces via that link in the chat. And that brings us to the end of this quarter's mosquito effects. Thank you to our listeners who have already started asking questions, and we'll get to those in a moment. Do feel free to add yours if you haven't already. And if you're dialed in via the phone handset, you unfortunately won't be able to ask questions on the call today, but you can feel free to email them over to us afterwards. Before we get started on the Q&A, I just wanted to remind you that Stewardship do provide an award-winning payroll bureau service. So if you're in need of some advice or guidance in keeping abreast of all the changes that we've been discussing in the previous 2 mosquito effects, do get in touch with us. If you're a trustee or a church or charity as well as a treasurer, you might also be interested in our trustee training on May the 14th in London. It explores how to comply with all the legal requirements of your role while maintaining a focus on biblical principles and trusting in God. Look out for more events for trustees later in the year too. You'll find them all at stewardship.org.uk/events.